Welcome back to Sunday evening devotions. The smell of coffee. It kind of stirs the senses. It's something that I like, a lot of people like, we desire it. There may be other things in your life that tickle your taste buds, or things that you really want and desire. Well, that's sort of what our story about tonight is all about. If you may remember, last time we were talking about the Israelites coming in close to the promised land, and we had this story with Balaam the prophet that began in Numbers chapter 21. And I'd mentioned that really the story kind of comes to its conclusion in Numbers 25. And so we want to say that last chapter for tonight. And then actually what you read, if you read through Numbers, chapters 25 through and 31 are like bookends that kind of wrap up that story of Balaam the prophet in a particular way, with some things in between. So what's happening? Well, what happens is, as we mentioned it before, Balaam could only bless the people of Israel, and so he leaves Balak, the king of the Moabites. And then chapter 25 begins with the people of Israel remaining where they were on the east side of the Jordan River in a place called the Acacia Grove, and they began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. So the women of Moab came and tempted the men of Israel and invited them to their feast for their gods, and to play and to do things together, obviously. And so the people of Israel, the men in particular, gave into that. And so God's anger was aroused in chapter 25. And so God says, because they had followed after other gods and they had followed these women, that the men that have done these things should be punished. And in the midst of this sort of conversation, we find this particularly dramatic account where the people are gathered before the tent of meeting, and they were supposed to, by God's command, kill the Israelites that were violating God's laws. And they were weeping before the temple, and in the midst of them, a man of Israel, from the leaders of one of the tribes, brings the Midianite women with him in the sight of everybody, and then what he does is he takes him into his tent and begins to have relations with her. And Phinehas, the priest, is just astounded at this obvious public sin, and he runs in and with a spear and kills them both. And so then God's anger is subsided a bit. But there was a plague that had broke out. And so all this comes to an end because of Phinehas' zeal for God. But there were like some 20-some thousand people that died in this whole thing. So a lot of the people of Israel were involved in this plague, and these actions. And so we're told then that God would maintain the people, and then we're told at the end of chapter 25 that the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Harass the Midianites and attack them, for they harassed you with their schemes, by which they seduced you in the matter of Peor." And so we have this kind of introduction to this battle. Well, then there's some intervening chapters before we get to chapter 31. And there's a census numbering the people before they go into the promised land. There's laws of inheritance. There's talk about the daily offerings and sacrifices, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Tabernacles, the feast days, and all these kind of things. And laws concerning vows. And then you get to chapter 31. And we go back then to the war on the Midianites. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take vengeance on the Midianites for the children of Israel." And so Moses is charged to do that. So what's happening here? Well, in chapter 31, what we learn is as the Israelites go to war against the Midianites for all that had happened, and the scheming, we find out that Balaam then is mentioned again in chapter 31, and he is put to death and killed because he had sought refuge with and was living amongst the Midianites. And then later on in the chapter we find out that it was Balaam's counsel to the Midianites and the Moabites to seduce Israel. He was the guy that was planning the scheme. He knew that the people would be unfaithful. And so as I'm thinking about this, what is God telling us? First he shows us the sin of Israel, right? That they fall into this. And then we find out the reason. There was a temptation by Balaam, this false prophet. Also, a thing I forgot I neglected to state, that in the middle here, between all the offerings and all these things, Moses was told that he was to appoint Joshua to be his next leader in chapter 27. And that's significant too, because Moses is not going to enter the promised land, and so God is saying, listen, you're going to hand leadership off to Joshua. And you remember that Jesus' name in Aramaic is the same as Joshua's name in Hebrew, Jehovah saves. So let's put the pieces together. What's happening? Well, I think what's happening is that, well, just like the coffee can arouse a desire in us, appetite, right? Or maybe something else. Maybe it's chocolate. Maybe it's something that you are seduced by. Not that coffee or chocolate is sin. Well, I'm not saying that. But it's reflective of the appetites of our heart, right? That's where sin begins. Sin begins in the heart, and it comes out in what we say. And I'm suspecting that the way this is written in chapter 25, the showing the sin of Israel first, and then chapter 31, the bookend, showing us that it was a temptation by Balaam, is that even though someone may scheme, Satan, someone else, Balaam, or a Balaam-like person, we may be tempted to sin, but the sin is from our heart. It is our appetite. That's our problem. That was Israel's problem. The point that God is showing us is that sin is in here, and the temptation comes from the outside, but it has a friend on the inside, and so that we are encouraged, right, to act on what's on the inside, the sin that's in our heart. And that's what Israel did. And so God is showing us that Israel in the heart was sinful. And so this talk about census and numbering and then the sacrifices, reminding there needs to be a payment for sin, the fact that Moses himself was reminded that he had sinned and would not go into the promised land, and the next person and successor would come whose name would be Jehovah Saves, is a picture of Christ. That we need a Savior. We can't save ourselves. We can't keep God's law by ourselves. And so all this is pointing to the fact that we need a Savior because our hearts are sinful. And our only hope is for God to save us. And so this whole account, and as we're told in the New Testament, these things were written for our instruction, and that we need a Savior. Well, that Savior is the Joshua of the New Testament, Jesus. Well, that's good news. Good night.